Hello, Vision Nation. You might find this shocking, but Warren Buffett still lives in the same house he bought over 60 years ago. In this week's episode, we'll cover that interesting story. You know, Warren Buffett has a lot of character traits that make him one of the best investors ever. And I think one of the things that led him to be so successful is his extreme frugality. He's known for being a very budget-focused person, and I think the story of his house purchase illustrates this perfectly. The other thing that we'll cover in this episode is research by two PhD guys who spent decades studying millionaires. They were trying to figure out their millionaire money habits. Their findings are important for anyone aspiring to increase their wealth. Okay, last thing I want to mention is that the Wall Street Vision website is now live. You can check it out at wallstreetvision.com. I would love to hear your feedback on the website. You can let me know your thoughts by emailing me at vlad@wallstreetvision.com. Thanks guys, and I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to Wall Street Vision Investing Podcast. This show is on true stories about markets and top investors. I'm Vlad Dolgochev. This show is for informational purposes only and is not investment advice. Check out the show notes for the full disclaimer. To start things off, I want to take you to the Midwest US in the 1950s. Warren Buffett was in his late 20s, and his family was getting bigger. You had him, his wife Susie, two young kids, and a third one on the way as well. They were at a point where their rental place wasn't going to cut it much longer, and they needed a housing upgrade. They looked at the classified ads and settled on this one house in Omaha on Farnham Street. To give you an idea of this place, it's 6,500 square feet, has 5 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms with a powder room. It's a nice brown-looking home with lots of windows in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Omaha. It's on this corner lot with some big evergreen trees and is surrounded with neatly trimmed hedges. Now, Warren's house is one of the bigger houses in the area, but it's not some sort of massive mansion. And he bought this house in Omaha in 1958, and he still lives in that house today. That right there is pretty curious, right? I mean, how many successful business people do you know who still live in the house that they bought in their late 20s? But this gets even more interesting when you think of the dollar figures involved. Using today's dollars, he bought the house for the equivalent of around $300,000 today. Having said that, Warren was in his late 20s at the time, and his net worth was the equivalent of around $10 million in today's money. And look, there's lots of factors at play here, but the important thing is that he bought a place to live in that was less than 3% of his total net worth. And if we dig deeper, I think there's a few reasons that he did this. He probably looked at the real estate returns in Omaha, which I'm guessing were under 5% per year, and he figured that he could return 20% or more investing in stocks. So using that kind of math, it makes a lot more sense to invest in stocks at 20% than having your money tied up in a house that's only increasing at 5% per year. His biography talks about how he always thought about the opportunity cost of capital. Now that's just a fancy way of saying that each time you spend $1, you should think about what alternative things you could get for that same dollar. Even when Warren would go get a haircut, he'd be saying stuff like, "Do I really want to spend $300,000 on a haircut?" Now that might seem kind of odd, But here's how the reverse math works out on that. $30, which is the cost of a haircut, invested at 21% for 50 years is going to be worth over $300,000. So Warren was always thinking about this sort of opportunity cost, because each dollar that he was spending, whether it was on a haircut or buying a house, that was a dollar that he couldn't invest. You can see why he was hesitating on buying the house in the first place. Well, 60 plus years later, and he's still living in the same place. Someone asked him why he hasn't moved, and Buffett's reply was, quote, "I'm happy here. I'd move if I thought I'd be happier somewhere else," end quote. Now, Warren practices extreme frugality. There's a story about him driving a Cadillac for something like 8 years or so. He would do that instead of constantly getting a new car, and his explanation for that is that his time is so valuable that the couple of hours spent buying the car and getting the registration set up and all of that stuff is just better spent doing investment stuff. So he's very aware of how much his time is worth, and he's super careful about what he allocates his time to. He basically set up this system where most of his time is spent focused on investing related activities. And anything that doesn't have to do with that, I'm sure he's found ways to outsource those sorts of things. Of course, Mr. Buffett is a genius investor. So let's break down the benefits of his sort of frugal lifestyle. Because if he's doing it, you know there's a good reason. Alright, so benefit number one, like we discussed, is having low expenses and living well below his means allowed him to invest more money into stocks. In turn, that allowed him to get higher returns on his money for longer periods of time, so he increased his wealth that way. So that takes us to benefit number two. Lowering his expenses also gave him some breathing room. His parents lived through the Great Depression, so I think Buffett had an appreciation of how bad things could get when the economy is not functioning well. Keeping his expenses low meant that he had the flexibility to weather any storm, even if his investments performed poorly or if his Buffett partnership business hit a rough patch. Okay, so now let's go over another story. This one is about these two PhD guys who got together and studied how people became wealthy in the US. These two guys started off by researching people in upscale neighborhoods, and they found out something weird. They realized that in a lot of cases, a bunch of people who lived in expensive homes and drove luxury cars didn't actually have a lot of wealth. They realized that the majority of people who had a high level of wealth were actually living in regular neighborhoods. And already that sounds kind of like Warren Buffett's situation, right? So that was a crazy realization for those PhD guys, and it led them on this deep 20-year research journey to figure out what people do to become wealthy. Now you might be thinking, what's going on here? How is it that people who display massive wealth don't necessarily have massive wealth? Well, the difference comes down to being income statement wealthy versus balance sheet wealthy. That sounds kind of complicated, so let me just break it down into simple terms. Basically, some of the people driving fancy cars might be making $1 million a year, but they also might be spending $1.2 million a year to maintain that lifestyle. Those people are income statement wealthy because they have a high income, but they might not actually have lots of assets. That's the type of classic scenario where wealth is not really being accumulated. Now compare that to a family that makes $200,000 a year, but saves $20,000. They're actually increasing their wealth year over year. They are balance sheet wealthy because their total assets are increasing year over year. Now look, that's a simplistic example, but it does illustrate that there's more to wealth than the appearance of wealth. So those two PhD guys ended up figuring out 7 factors that set wealthy people apart. And they wrote a book called The Millionaire Next Door. Now in this episode, I'm just going to cover the first factor that they discovered, which is a really important one. And the first factor is all about the importance of being frugal. Now before we dive into what those two PhD guys found, I want to mention that if you're enjoying the podcast, please follow us or subscribe using your podcast app. That way you'll be the first to know of any future episodes. Investing is not easy, but it is simple. So I want to share what I've learned from the top investors about investing and making money. By the way, I want to help as many people as possible, and the only way we can grow our Vision Nation community is with your help. So if you have a friend who's interested in investing, I would really appreciate it if you told them about our podcast. Thank you so much, guys. Alright, back to the show. So we're talking about this Millionaire Next Door book that those two PhD guys wrote. Now the original book is outdated in a few ways. It was published in the late 90s, so obviously the specific numbers like dollar amounts and percentages need a refresher. But the philosophy that wealthy people have and the mindset that they use in order to become rich is foundational. That's the type of stuff that doesn't change. So one of their big takeaways was that a lot of the millionaires they studied became wealthy through being frugal. Another way of thinking about this is to put your investor hat on. If you're investing in a business, you probably want the business to have high margins, right? High margins means that the business is earning lots of profit for every dollar of sales. So you can look at your household in the same way. If your household is earning $100,000 per year and your expenses are $95,000, that's a type of business that's not going to be super resilient in a tough economic situation. But if a household is earning $100,000 and the yearly expenses are only $80,000, that's a much better situation. One of the cool examples in the book was when they talked about how much money the millionaires spent on their most expensive suit or most expensive watch that they owned. In both cases, the millionaires got value deals that anybody who's in the middle class could easily afford. So these millionaires are not blowing thousands of dollars on a new Versace suit every month. And now I want to mention a few actionable tools that the book discussed as well. Simple stuff that millionaires did to help them achieve their wealth. Budgeting is the first one. The millionaires studied were very aware of how much their household spent on food, clothing, and shelter. Why keep track of expenses? Well, it helps you make sure that the expenses don't get out of hand. And it also allows you to find additional ways to save money. As an example, if you know that you spend $200 on your phone bill each month, it's easy to ask a friend how much money they spend and maybe figure out if you should change plans. I get a sense that Warren Buffett kept a very close eye on his household expenses as he was building up his wealth. Now, this is also something that I do personally. At the end of every month, I have a simple spreadsheet that shows all my income earned and all of my expenses. Now, it's not very high tech, but it is very simple and it works. So what I do is I download data from my banking website and I just paste it into the spreadsheet. The whole thing probably takes me 10 minutes a month, but it gives me a clear idea of where I am. Some people take this to a whole nother level, right? I have a family friend, let's call him Dimitri to protect the innocent. And Dimitri is a coupon fanatic. I mean, this guy gathers up all the weekly flyers and he has a spreadsheet open to figure out where he should get his chicken cutlets that week. This guy will have a printout of what he should get at which store, and then he brings all these coupons to do price matching as well. Like, he'll literally make a plan to go to different grocery stores to buy different groceries. So he's going to get, apples from one grocery store and then go and get bananas at another one. So grocery shopping probably takes his family around 5 to 6 hours every week. Now that's taking it to a whole nother level. And at some point, you've got to start thinking about how much your time is worth compared to how much money you're saving. Anyway, I don't think you need to be that fanatical about every dollar that you spend. I'm not recommending that you get free ketchup packets from McDonald's and then squeeze those into your ketchup bottle at home. But being conscious around the big ticket items and any of those recurring charges is a really good idea. I think that this is stuff that Warren Buffett did earlier in his career. And I think that anybody trying to build their wealth needs to keep a close eye on their expenses as well. Alright, so to sum up what we've covered, it's important to be aware of the opportunity cost of your money, and being frugal is a key cornerstone that will help increase your wealth. Alright, Vision Nation, that wraps it up for this week's episode. If you've enjoyed it, please hit the subscribe button, leave a review, and if you know someone who's interested in investing, please share this episode with them. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an amazing day.